I first noticed the light was different through the chain link fence at dawn, not the cold, steel gray light that rose over the training camps in Bavaria, but something warmer, almost gold, spilling across the Kansas flatland like it had nowhere else to be. I stood at the barrack window with my hands pressed against the sill, watching American workers arrive for the day shift at the camp's construction site. They carried lunch pails. They laughed. One of them, a man with a red face and overalls, poured coffee from a thermos, and the steam rose in a slow curl that I could see from 50 meters away. I smelled it too somehow, or maybe I imagined it. Fresh coffee, real bread, the kind my mother used to bake before the rationing started. Behind me, on the plank table, sat my own breakfast, a thin porridge of ersatz grain that tasted like sawdust and regret. That was the moment. Not the capture, not the transport across the Atlantic in the cargo hold, not even the first night in this place. It was the coffee steam and the laughter and the light that didn't apologize for itself. Because everything the Reich had told us, everything I had believed, everything I had fought for, said that we were the chosen, the disciplined, the superior. That our enemies were weak, corrupt, barely human. Yet here I was, a prisoner, and these Americans treated me like I still had a name. The guards called me by it. They nodded when I passed. Yesterday, one of them helped me carry a crate of tools without a word, just a brief glance that said, "You're a man. I'm a man. This is work." No sneer, no cruelty, just dignity I had not earned and did not expect. I stood there until the sun cleared the horizon, until the light no longer looked foreign, and I realized I had no idea what to do with the truth that was forming in my chest. The world I had known was a lie, and if that was true, then who was I? Question opened inside me like a wound, quiet and clean, and I knew it would not close until I had an answer. The workers finished their coffee. The day began. And I turned from the window, still holding the ration tin, already understanding that everything would have to be rebuilt from this moment forward. The noise had always been there before. Anthems, speeches, the constant drumbeat of certainty that told us exactly who we were and what we were meant to do. But here, in the days after the window, I found myself wrapped in a stillness I had never known. I stopped speaking at meals. I stopped joining the card games in the evening. When Otto and the others gathered in the corner of the barracks to recite the old slogans, to reassure each other that the Führer would turn the tide, that we were still soldiers of the Reich, I turned my face to the wall and pretended to sleep. Their voices felt like static now, interference between me and something I needed to hear. The silence let me see. Every morning the sun poured through the barrack windows without asking permission, without rationing itself the way everything had been rationed back home: food, fuel, hope, truth. The light here was American light, I suppose, careless and abundant, and I began to notice it everywhere, in the way it pooled on the mess hall floor, in the way it lit the pages of the newspapers the guards left on the benches. English newspapers, uncensored. I couldn't read them yet, but I could see the photographs, cities, factories, crowds of people who did not look starved or beaten. I could see the contrast between what I was looking at and what I had been told to believe. Then, 3 days after I stopped talking, one of the guards approached me during the work detail. His name was Sergeant Howell. He handed me a slim blue booklet, an English primer, the kind you would give a child. "You want to understand what's happening," he said, not as a question. "You'll need this." I took it. I didn't thank him. I didn't know how. But that night, by the light that no one rationed, I opened the first page. The cat sat on the mat. Ridiculous, humiliating, necessary. Because if resolution meant anything, it couldn't mean clinging to the lies just because they were comfortable. It had to mean unlearning, brick by brick, until I could stand on something solid. I still didn't understand why they were teaching me, why they offered newspapers, why Sergeant Howell looked at me like I was worth the effort. That question hung in the stillness, unanswered, a thread I would have to follow. But for now, I had the primer, I had the light. And I had the first quiet sense that agency, real agency, might mean choosing clarity over loyalty, even if it cost me everything I used to be. The stillness gave me space to remember, and memory split everything in half. There was the Germany I had left, my father's machine shop in Stuttgart, the smell of oil and iron, the pride in his voice when he said we were building the future. I was 17 when I enlisted, old enough to believe the speeches, young enough to think war was a kind of poetry. The day I left, my mother pressed a small iron cross into my palm, and my father shook my hand like I was already a man. The fatherland needed us. We were the answer to chaos, the cure for weakness. I believed it the way you believe in gravity, completely, without question, because everything around me said it was true. Then there was this Germany, the one I was living now, 6 months into captivity, where the Geneva Convention wasn't just a piece of paper, but a daily fact. The guards didn't beat us. The Red Cross parcels arrived on schedule. We had access to a library, shelves of books in German and English, and on Saturday nights they played jazz over the camp speakers. Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, music the Reich had called degenerate. I watched black soldiers and white soldiers eat together in the mess hall, not segregated, not silent, just men sharing a table. It was such a small thing, it shouldn't have mattered, but it shattered something inside me, because back home we had been taught that race determined everything, that hierarchy was natural, that some people were born to serve and others to lead. Yet here they were, passing the salt, laughing at the same joke, and no one's world was ending. Otto saw it too, but he couldn't let it in. He was my bunkmate, a Bavarian farm boy with a brother who died at Stalingrad. One night, after the jazz had finished and the lights were low, he whispered to me, "If they lied about this, then Klaus died for nothing." His voice cracked. I understood then that his loyalty wasn't about belief, it was about survival. If the Reich was a lie, then his grief had no meaning, and meaning was the only thing holding him together. I didn't answer him. I couldn't offer him the truth, because the truth was a wound, and I was still learning how to carry my own. 6 months. That was the realism of it, long enough to see patterns, short enough that hope still flickered that the war might turn, that we might go home to the world we remembered. But I was beginning to suspect that world had never existed, not the way we thought it did. There were 2 Germanys now, the one I had believed in and the one I was starting to see, and I would have to choose. The choice arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a man in a chaplain's collar who introduced himself as Father Sullivan. He found me in the library corner where I had been working through the English primer, mouthing words I barely understood. He sat down across from me without asking, folded his hands on the table and said, "Sergeant Howell tells me you're making progress." I nodded. I didn't know what else to do. Then he slid a stack of letters across the wood, envelopes with German addresses, cramped handwriting, the desperate kind you see from people who need an answer. "Some of the men can't read English well enough to write home," he said. "I thought you might help translate. No pressure, but it would be a kindness." Duty would have told me to refuse. Duty to the Reich, to the oaths I had sworn, to the idea that cooperation was betrayal. But duty felt like an old coat I had outgrown, threadbare and tight across the shoulders. What I felt instead was curiosity. Not the kind that burns, but the kind that builds, slow and deliberate, brick by brick. I wanted to know what these men were writing. I wanted to see what they were becoming, here in this strange captivity where the light didn't ration itself, and the guards treated us like we still had futures. So I said yes. Father Sullivan smiled, a small, tired smile, and told me there was one more thing. The church in town, First Lutheran, was hosting a social on Saturday. A dance. Families, music, food. Some of the POWs had been invited, the ones who had earned trust through work details. He thought I might like to come. A dance. With Americans. With the enemy. The idea should have repulsed me, but it didn't. It felt like a door opening onto a room I hadn't known existed. I told him I would think about it. But I had already decided. Because if I was going to reconcile the truth with the lies, if I was going to understand what had been done to me and what I had done in return, I couldn't do it from the margins. I had to step into it. I had to see. That night, I used the last of my monthly script to buy a small notebook from the camp commissary, plain brown cover, 40 pages, the kind a schoolboy might carry. I opened it to the first page and wrote the date, November 14th, 1944. Then I wrote a single line, "Document what you see, not to betray, to know." If you've ever questioned a story you were raised to believe, you'll understand what happened next. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't revenge. It was something quieter and more dangerous, the decision to stop accepting and start witnessing. To collect the receipts of my own transformation, one observation at a time, until I could no longer deny what they added up to. The letter sat on my bunk, waiting. The invitation to the dance felt like a test I hadn't studied for. But the notebook was mine, and for the first time since the window, I felt something other than confusion. I felt purpose. Duty had been imposed on me. Curiosity I chose, and that made all the difference. The notebook became my map through territory I didn't have words for yet. Every evening, after lights out, I would lie on my bunk with a flashlight I had borrowed from the supply shed, angled so the beam fell only on the page, and I would write, not thoughts, I didn't trust those yet, but facts, observations, the kind of evidence that couldn't be argued with because it simply was. November 18th, work detail at Morrison Farm, 8 hours picking late corn, paid $0.80 in scrip at day's end. Morrison's son brought water to the field twice, called me by name. No guards present for the last hour. We were trusted not to run. Where would we run to, and why? November 22nd. Attended church social at First Lutheran. Pastor's wife, Mrs. Schneider, herself German, from Pennsylvania, served me pot roast and potatoes on a real plate, not a tin. She asked about my family. I told her about Stuttgart, about my father's shop. She nodded and said she would pray for them. I didn't know what to do with kindness that asked for nothing in return, so I said, thank you, and meant it. November 26th. Newspaper left in the day room. Kansas City Star, 3 days old. Front page. Photographs from a place called Majdanek. Barbed wire, ovens, bodies stacked like firewood. The article said it was a labor camp, but the photographs said it was something else. I read it twice, then I fold. At the paper, walked outside and stood in the cold until I stopped shaking. Wrote nothing that night. Couldn't. The evidence accumulated like snow. Silent, steady, impossible to ignore. The farmers paid us fairly, not because they had to, but because that was the contract. The scrip was real currency. We could buy cigarettes, soap, writing paper at the commissary. On Sundays, those of us who wanted could attend services in town, escorted but not guarded. And afterward there was always coffee and conversation. American farmers asking about German agriculture, comparing crop yields and soil types like we were colleagues, not captives. The contrast was everywhere. I was technically a prisoner, yet I had more freedom here than I ever had in the Reich. I could read what I wanted, say what I thought, at least to myself. Choose whether to attend chapel or stay behind. Small freedoms, maybe, but they were mine. Then, in early December, the pattern interrupt arrived. His name was Lieutenant Steinberg, a signals officer assigned to the camp administration, and he was Jewish. I knew because Otto had pointed him out with a sneer, using the old slurs, and I had said nothing because I was still a coward in some ways. But one afternoon, Steinberg stopped me near the recreation hall and asked if I was the one translating letters. I said yes. He nodded, then told me his family had come from Cologne in 1920, that his grandparents still spoke German at home, that his father had fought for Germany in the First War and received the Iron Cross. And then the laws changed, he said, his voice quiet and level. And suddenly we weren't German anymore, so we left. My father likes to say we didn't abandon Germany. Germany abandoned us first. He didn't say it with anger. He said it the way you state a fact, a piece of history you've made peace with because you had no other choice. And I stood there, holding my notebook, and realized that this man, the enemy, the subhuman, the threat we were taught to fear, was more free than I had ever been. He had chosen his country, he had chosen his future. I had been told mine, and I had accepted it without question. And now I was standing in a prison camp in Kansas, learning that captivity and liberation were not opposites. They were states of mind. That night, by flashlight, I wrote it all down. The farm wages, the church supper, the newspaper photographs, Lieutenant Steinberg's story. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the facts formed a shape I could almost see, the outline of a world I had been lied to about, and the beginning of a self I might still become. I hid the notebook under my mattress, away from Otto, away from the others who weren't ready to see what I was seeing. The light from the flashlight was small, but it was enough. It always had been. I just hadn't known to look for it until now. The notebook disappeared on a Thursday morning while I was at the translation table with Father Sullivan. I knew immediately, the way you know a bone is broken before the pain arrives, that Otto had found it. I had been careless, distracted by the accumulation of evidence, and I had left it tucked only halfway beneath the mattress. When I returned to the barracks after lunch, he was standing in the center aisle with the brown cover open in his hands, and 8 other men were gathered around him in a loose circle. The air had the electric stillness that comes before violence. "Read this," Otto said, his voice loud enough to carry through the whole barracks. He wasn't talking to me, he was performing for the others, and I understood then that this wasn't about the notebook. It was about control, about keeping the old story alive, because the alternative was unbearable. He read aloud, stumbling over my handwriting. "Morrison's son brought water to the field, called me by name. No guards present. We were trusted not to run. Trusted." He spat the word like it was poison. "You write about trust while our brothers are dying in France, while the fatherland is under siege. You sit here taking their scrip, eating their food, writing their propaganda." I could have defended myself. I could have explained that the notebook was private, that documentation wasn't betrayal, that truth was not the same as treason. But I didn't. Because somewhere in the weeks of writing by flashlight, of collecting receipts and watching the light pour through windows that didn't ration it, I had crossed a line Otto couldn't see yet. His rage was the rage of a man clinging to a sinking ship, screaming at the water for rising. My calm, and I was calm, unnervingly so, was the calm of someone who had already let go. "You're right," I said, and the barracks went quiet. "I did write that. I wrote all of it, every observation, every fact, and none of it is propaganda, Otto. It's just what happened." I stepped forward, not aggressive, just present, and held out my hand for the notebook. "Give it back." He didn't. Instead, he tore the first page out, then the second, and let them fall to the floor. Someone laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. Someone else called me a collaborator, a coward, worse. The circle tightened. I felt the old instinct rising, the one that said I should fight, should prove my loyalty, should do whatever it took to belong. But belonging to a lie wasn't belonging. It was just another kind of captivity. So I stood there, watching my evidence scatter across the floorboards, and I said nothing. The silence was my answer. The fracture might have turned into something uglier. Otto's fists were clenched, and the men behind him were feeding off his anger. But then the door opened and Captain Lewis, the camp commander, stepped inside with 2 guards. Someone had reported the commotion. Lewis took one look at the torn pages, at Otto's red face, at me standing in the center of the wreckage, and he understood immediately. He had seen this before. Every POW camp had the same fault line, those who were ready to move forward and those who would cling to the Reich until it dragged them under. "Hoffman," he said, using my surname, "collect your things. You're transferring to Barrack C." It wasn't a question. It was safety, and maybe salvation, though I didn't realize that yet. Historical record shows they did this often, separated the fervent Nazis from the cooperative prisoners, the ones who were willing to let the war end inside them before it ended on the maps. I gathered my spare shirt, my primer, my shaving kit. Otto dropped the notebook onto my bunk, what was left of it, and turned his back. No one said goodbye. No one had to. We all knew what the fracture meant. I was no longer one of them, and they were no longer part of the world I was learning to live in. Barrack C was quieter, older men mostly, the ones who had stopped pretending weeks ago. My new bunk was near the eastern wall, and it had a window, a small one, but it faced east, toward the place I used to call home. I stood there that first evening and watched the sun set behind me, casting long shadows toward Germany, and I realized I was no longer looking for dawn in that direction. The light I needed was here. It always had been. I just had to stop facing the wrong way to see it. Clarity came with a price, and I paid it in increments over the winter months. The first cost was work. Otto's faction, 12 men who had appointed themselves guardians of the Reich's honor, began sabotaging the details I was assigned to. Tools went missing. Equipment broke in ways that looked like accidents but weren't. A full crate of seedling trays I was transporting to the Morrison farm tipped off the truck bed, and though no one saw who loosened the tailgate latch, I knew. Captain Lewis knew too, but proof was another matter. He pulled me from external work details for 2 weeks while he investigated, which meant I lost the scrip income and the freedom of the open fields. It meant sitting idle while the others went out, feeling the weight of their stares when they returned. The second cost was connection. Letters from home had been irregular since my capture. The war was eating infrastructure and mail routes collapsed like dominoes. But by February, they stopped entirely. I waited every distribution day, watching Father Sullivan sort envelopes, hoping for my mother's careful script or my father's blunt printing. Nothing came. At night, in Barrack C, I lay awake doing the math I didn't want to do. Stuttgart was in the path of Allied bombing runs. The factory district where my father worked was a strategic target. Silence could mean many things, but none of them were good. I had chosen clarity, but clarity meant accepting that I might never see them again, might never explain what I had learned, might carry this transformation alone into whatever future waited. The isolation should have broken me. In some ways it did. There were nights I questioned everything, nights the notebook felt like a curse instead of a compass. But isolation also clarified. It stripped away the noise of belonging, the desperate need to be part of something even if that something was a lie. In Barrack C, the men didn't demand loyalty tests. They were too tired, too worn by their own reckonings. We coexisted in a kind of truce with ourselves, and that was enough. Then, in March, Otto appeared at the door of Barrack C after evening count. He stood in the threshold, not entering, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him look smaller than I remembered. "Can we talk?" he said, and his voice had lost its edge. I followed him outside to the fence line, where the Kansas wind was starting to warm and the fields beyond Stjar, etched flat and endless under a sky going purple with dusk. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just stood there gripping the chain link and said, "I'm terrified it was all for nothing." His voice cracked on the last word. "Klaus, the war, everything we believed, if it was a lie, then what was the point? Why did he die? Why did any of them die?" And I saw it then, the thing I had been too angry to see before. Otto's rage wasn't about ideology, it was about grief. He needed the Reich to be true because if it wasn't, then his brother's death had no meaning, and meaning was the only thing separating him from the abyss. I wanted to tell him that meaning wasn't something you inherited from a regime, that he could make his own, but I didn't because he wasn't ready and I wasn't his savior. So I said, "I don't know, Otto, I don't know why any of it happened, but I know that holding on to the lie won't bring him back." He didn't respond. He just let go of the fence and walked away, and I let him go. That was the contrast between us. He wanted revenge against the truth for shattering him. I wanted resolution, to name what had been done, to hold the boundary between the past and the person I was becoming, and to forgive without returning to the place that broke me. The final cost arrived in April. The newspapers that week carried photographs and testimony from Buchenwald, from Dachau, from camps whose names I had never heard, but whose evidence I could not unsee. Prisoners, Jews, political dissidents, Roma, people whose only crime was existing in defiance of the Reich's vision, starved to skeletons, mass graves, gas chambers described in clinical detail by Allied investigators. I read the articles in the day room, alone, while the spring light poured through the windows with its usual indifference. And my worldview, which had been cracking since the morning the barrack window, shattered completely. I had known we were wrong. I had suspected we were cruel. But this was evil on a scale I didn't have language for, and I had been part of it. Not directly, perhaps. I had never guarded a camp or pulled a trigger against a civilian, but I had worn the uniform. I had believed the speeches. I had cheered when they told us we were cleansing the fatherland. Complicity didn't require pulling the lever. It only required not asking what the lever was attached to. That night, I wrote in what remained of the notebook. The cost of clarity is knowing what you were part of. The cost of moving forward is carrying it anyway. The light from my flashlight seemed dimmer, or maybe I was just seeing more clearly. Either way, I knew there was no going back. The only direction left was through. The assembly was scheduled for May 10th, a Thursday, and it was voluntary. Captain Lewis made that clear in the announcement. No one would be forced to attend. No one would be punished for staying away. But the camp administration wanted us to hear from someone who had survived what we were only beginning to understand from newspaper photographs and radio reports. A witness. The word went through the barracks like a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples were fear, curiosity, dread, something close to relief. They held it outdoors at noon, in the open yard between the barracks and the mess hall, where the Kansas sun was high and unforgiving, and there were no shadows to hide in. 140 of us gathered, some because they wanted to know, some because they were still deciding whether to believe, some because the not knowing had become worse than any truth could be. I stood near the back with the men from Barrack C. Otto was there too, 15 meters away with his faction, his face unreadable. The witness was a man named David Levin. He wore a U.S. Army uniform with a translator's I saw it insignia, and he was thin in a way that spoke of years, not weeks. When he stepped onto the makeshift platform, 2 pallets and a plank, the noise of restless men settling into place died immediately. He didn't start with accusations, he started with facts. His name, his birthplace, Krakow, his profession before the war, teacher, his family, parents, 2 sisters, a wife, a daughter. Their names. He said them slowly, like he was placing stones on graves, and then he told us what had happened to them. Auschwitz. The word hung in the air, and those of us who had been reading the papers knew it, but hearing it spoken by someone who had been there, who had the number tattooed on his forearm and the weight of it in his voice, was different. He described the selection process, left for work, right for the chambers. He described the smoke, the smell, the casual efficiency of industrialized death. He didn't shout, he didn't weep, he simply testified, and the silence around him was absolute, the kind of silence that has gravity, that pulls everything into it. I don't know when I decided to stand. It wasn't planned, it wasn't courage, not the kind they give medals for. It was just the recognition that silence could be witness or complicity, and I had spent too long on the wrong side of that line. I stood, and the movement drew eyes, and Captain Lewis nodded at me like he had been waiting. I pulled the notebook from my pocket, pages missing, spine cracked, but still intact, and I walked to the front. "My name is Johann Hoffmann," I said, and my voice sounded strange in the open air, smaller than I expected but steady. "I was a soldier of the Reich. I believed what they told us. I didn't question it because I didn't think I needed to. But I was wrong." I opened the notebook to the first entry that still remained, the one from November about the farm wages and the trust. This is what I saw here. This is what they didn't tell us was possible. And I read. Not all of it, there wasn't time, and some of it was too private, but enough. I didn't have advanced degrees or secrets to trade. What I had was a choice. I could return to a Germany built on the lie I had spent 8 months unlearning, or I could stay in the country that had taught me what I should have known all along, that dignity was not rationed, that truth was not negotiable, that a man could rebuild himself if he was willing to stand in the light and see what he had been. The application was 6 pages, single-spaced, and it asked for everything: military history, work record, references, reasons for seeking asylum. I wrote it longhand at the library table, with Father Sullivan reading over my shoulder to check my English. For the section labeled Justification, I wrote, "I cannot return to a country that built its future on a lie I believed and that murdered millions while I looked away. I am not asking America to forgive me. I am asking for the chance to build something true." Father Sullivan didn't correct a word. Then I wrote the letter. It took 3 days and 7 drafts before I had something I could send, something that balanced honesty with love, confession with hope. I addressed it to my parents, assuming they were still alive, knowing I might never get confirmation either way. "Dear Mama and Papa," I began, "by the time you receive this, if you receive it, I will have made a choice that may hurt you. I am staying in America, not because I have abandoned you, but because I cannot come home to a place built on what we now know was done. I have enclosed pages from a notebook I kept here. Read them, and you will understand. Or you will not, and I will carry that too. I love you. I am sorry. I am alive, and I am trying to be honest, and those are the only 2 things I can promise." I tucked 5 pages from the notebook into the envelope. The entries about the farm, the church supper, Lieutenant Steinberg, the assembly, the testimony. Evi. Dense. Receipts. The things I had witnessed that changed me. I walked to the camp post office and handed it to the clerk, a young private who looked at the Stuttgart address and said, "Hope it gets there, buddy." I did too. But I wasn't waiting for permission or understanding. I was setting a boundary. I would not return to a Germany that denied the truth. Exile, yes, but exile that felt like freedom, because I was choosing it. The contrast was everywhere. Men around me packed their belongings, traded addresses, made plans to reunite with families and rebuild the fatherland from its ruins. They saw repatriation as an ending, a return to the interrupted story of their lives. I saw it as a door I was closing. Not with anger, anger would have been easier, but with the quiet resolve of someone who knows that some crossings are one way, and that's the cost of becoming the person you were supposed to be all along. Otto came to see me the day before his transport was scheduled. He returned the notebook, all of it, pages smoothed and edges worn from handling. "I read it," he said, "twice. I don't know if I can do what you're doing. I don't know if I'm strong enough, but I understand now why you had to." We shook hands. We didn't pretend we would write or stay in touch. Some friendships are only meant to last as long as the crucible that formed them, and that was fine. He had his path, I had mine. If this story moved you, share it. Because the truth, no matter how painful, is the only foundation for a future. That's what I learned in the Kansas camp with the light that didn't ration itself and the guards who saw me as a man before they saw me as an enemy. The truth costs. It isolates. It demands you give up the comfort of belonging to something bigger than yourself if that something is built on lies. But the alternative, carrying the lie forward, pretending you don't know what, costs more. It costs your integrity, your future, yourself. By July, my asylum application was approved. I had references from Captain Lewis, Father Sullivan, and 3 farmers I had worked for during the details. I had a sponsor, a Lutheran congregation in Topeka that agreed to help me find work and housing. I had a photograph of the camp library, the place where I had learned English and begun to understand that knowledge was not the enemy, ignorance was. I kept that photograph in the notebook, next to the entries that had rebuilt me line by line, observation by observation, truth by painful truth. I was 20 years old, I was stateless, I was free, and for the first time in my life, those things did not contradict each other. The letter from Otto arrived on a Tuesday in October, 17 years after the war ended. I was living in Lincoln, Nebraska by then, teaching history at the high school 3 blocks from the house I had saved 5 years to buy. My name was still Johann Hoffman, but my students called me Mr. Hoffman, and my neighbors knew me as the German teacher who coached the debate team and grew tomatoes that won ribbons at the county fair. I had become American in the way immigrants do, not by forgetting where I came from, but by building something new with the tools the old country never gave me. The envelope had a Munich postmark and handwriting I recognized immediately, even though I hadn't seen it in nearly 2 decades. I sat down at the kitchen table with my coffee and opened it carefully, the way you handle things that might break you. Inside were 3 pages, written in the careful German of a man who had learned to measure his words. "Johann," it began. "I don't know if this address is still good, or if you'll want to hear from me. But I am writing anyway, because I owe you a debt I have never acknowledged. You were right, about all of it. It took me years to admit that, longer than it should have. I went home after the war and tried to pretend nothing had changed, but everything had changed. I couldn't unhear what David Levin said. I couldn't unsee your notebook. So I started small. I enrolled in university. I studied engineering. I married a woman who lost her entire family in the bombing of Dresden and who taught me that grief does not have to become bitterness. We have 2 daughters now. I am teaching them to question everything the way I should have been taught. I am teaching them that loyalty without truth is just obedience to lies. I wanted you to know that. I wanted you to know that what you did, standing up at that assembly, reading from that notebook, it mattered. It saved me, even if it took me too long to let it." I read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it in the desk drawer where I kept the original notebook, the one I had carried from Kansas to Topeka to Lincoln, the artifact of my own crossing. Otto had found his path. He had rebuilt in the rubble of the old Germany, choosing to make something different from what we had been given. I had rebuilt here, in a country that had been my captor and then my teacher, and finally my home. Different paths. Same destination, the choice to live in the light instead of the lie. That afternoon, I stood in front of my 11th grade history class and did what I did every October when we reached the unit on World War II. I told them my story. Not all of it. There were parts too raw, too private, but enough. I told them about the barrack window, about the morning I realized everything I believed was wrong. I told them about the notebook, about the assembly, about the choice between returning to a comfortable lie or staying with an uncomfortable truth. And then I told them what I had learned, what I wanted them to carry forward into whatever future they would build. Light, I said, and I could hear my accent still. The slight German edge that never fully disappeared was the thing I noticed first. Not freedom in the abstract, not democracy as a concept, just light, sunlight that poured through windows without asking permission, that wasn't rationed or controlled or weaponized. In the camp where I was held as a prisoner of war, I had more light than I ever had in the Reich. And I realized that light, truth, dignity, freedom, the right to think for yourself, these things were never rationed in America. They were abundant. They were assumed. They were so fundamental that Americans didn't even notice them, the way you don't notice the air until it's taken away. I paused, looked at the young faces watching me, some bored, some engaged, some beginning to understand that history was not something distant and abstract, but something that lived in the choices people made when the world asked them who they wanted to be. I came to America a prisoner of war, I said. I left a prisoner of lies, and finally, I was free. The bell rang. The students gathered their books and filed out, already thinking about lunch or the game on Friday or the college applications they were writing. But a few lingered, there were always a few, to ask questions, to sit with the discomfort of realizing that ordinary people, people like them, could be taught to believe terrible things and never question them. That was why I taught. Not to shame them or to preach, but to ensure that no one else was fed the propaganda I had swallowed, that no one else reached 20 years old before learning that truth was not the enemy and questioning was not betrayal. That evening, I sat on the porch with the last of the October lights slanting gold across the lawn, and I thought about the two letters, the one Otto had written to me and the one I had written to my parents all those years ago that had never been answered. I had made peace with that silence. Some reconciliations happen, and some don't, and you carry both. What mattered was that I had chosen to live in the truth, even when the truth isolated me. Even when it cost me the home I had known and the people I had loved. The cost had been high. But the alternative, living the lie, pretending I didn't know what I knew, would have cost me myself. The contrast was complete now, the arc from captivity to purpose. I had been a prisoner twice. Once behind chain link in Kansas, and once behind the bars of ideology that told me I was superior when I was only obedient, that I was strong when I was only scared, that I was free when I was only told what to think. The first captivity ended when the war did. The second captivity ended the morning I stood at the barrack window and saw the light breaking differently and realized I had a choice. I chose the light. I chose the truth. I chose the future over the past, clarity over comfort, exile over complicity. And in doing so, I became the man I was always supposed to be, not the soldier the Reich tried to make me, but the teacher, the witness, the person who stood up when it mattered and said, I see it now, and I will not look away. The sun set. The Nebraska sky turned purple and gold, the way the Kansas sky had all those years ago when I first noticed that light was different here, unrationed and unafraid. I went inside, turned on the lamp at my desk, and began grading essays. 17-year-olds wrestling with questions about justice and power and what ordinary people owe to the truth. I wrote in the margins, asking them to think deeper, to question harder, to never accept easy answers just because they were comfortable. That was my work now. That was the life I had rebuilt, one choice at a time, one student at a time, one moment of courage at a time. The war had ended decades ago. But the lesson, that truth costs, that freedom requires vigilance, that light must be tended or it goes out, that lesson was eternal. And I would teach it until I had no voice left because I knew what happened when people stopped asking questions. I knew because I had been one of them. And then, by grace and by choice, I had become something else.